Before we mash these two georeference maps together, it's worthwhile to take a quick look at the finished product, which I've got here. And notice how this is a more effective communication of that USGS map. Hills that have shade actually reflect that shade. You can see it in the map. So if you compare that to this, this appears much more flat, even though it has all of that visual information that conveys where the hills are and what's a valley and what's a ridge. It's just harder to understand compared to this. So this shading is not added in Google Earth. It's something that we'll be adding to the graphic. Now if I rotate this, you can still see it's just a flat file, even though it looks like it's a 3D model. And you can even see where where contours are closer together, it's of course steeper and would have more shade associated with it. If I turn on my terrain in Google Earth, that effect is even amplified. And the terrain in conjunction with the graphic communication make for a very effective presentation of this map data. And this is not just for applying shade to USGS topo maps, it's just to give you a workflow that you can apply to any number of maps that you may encounter. So let's move that out of the way. Back at these two guys, I'd like to just for a moment talk about the mosaicing feature. The condition for images to be mosaiced is that they have to be geo-referenced. And I can see that my USGS is set to this NAD 27 and my DEM is set to WGS 84. They have to be geo-referenced. They don't have to be the same, they just have to each be correctly geo-referenced. They can be different image color modes, they can be different image bit depths, they can be different resolutions, they just need to be geo-referenced. But there's something you really need to be aware of here as when you have one selected, so for example, I've got my DEM selected, and anything that I mosaic with that will inherit the destination properties in terms of color mode and resolution. So I've only got one other file open, so if I click to add that and click OK, the computer thinks for a moment, I can see that it's added it in the layers. But notice the DEM represents a considerably larger amount of real world than the USGS map does. It's right here. It's this tiny little thing. This is where it's imported. So if I zoom in, a few things happened. One is it converted it to black and white, 16-bit color depth, but it also changed the resolution. That's not really usable anymore in terms of communicating topology. If I were to do it the other way around, so I start with this and I click the mosaic, tried to add that over. You don't want to do this because if I look at my resolution and my color mode and my file size, I can see that that represents or turns into a considerably large file. That's 36 megabytes. So this little rectangle here would represent 36 megabytes, and this graphic would be resampled to match the color and resolution, and short story is it would be a very, very large unmanageable file. You can still do it, but I believe, I don't think there's any warnings that, hey, it's not a bad idea. You just don't want to do it. But we still want to merge these. So the issue becomes, how do we get just the part we want out of this? And we've actually answered that question by first mosaicing this piece. That gives you a layer which you can snap to, which you can also crop to. So I've grabbed the Photoshop crop tool, and again, this is the really cool thing about this georeference. It's non-destructive. Any kind of cropping you do, the georeferencing data is retained. So if I crop it, this area is now representative of the same USGS topo map. But there's a problem. Notice how it's kind of gray and muddy. The reason for that is, and I'm just going to do an undo crop here. Let me zoom out. So I can see the map once again right down here. The reason it's kind of gray, even though Los Alamos has a reasonable amount of topographic change, is in the big picture of things, it represents a very small range. We've got mountains here and valleys here, so thousands of meters of range, and we're just kind of looking at a very small portion of that. So what I'll do next, it's more of a hack. It's more of a presentational hack because we're not doing it for the purpose of analyzing slope or maintaining any cell data that may be associated with this DEM. We simply want to communicate where there's a valley, where there's a hill, and where that shade would fall. And that's a lot easier if we can readjust our map so the highest point of just this little section is white and the lowest point of this little section is black. So there's a few ways to do this. There's a few technical ways, but this is by far the easiest. And it's something we've already done in class, and it's just adding a gradient map adjustment layer and essentially changing visually where the white starts and where the black starts. So to do that, I'll zoom out a little bit. I want to see, kind of the context around my little area here. Highlight the DEM layer because that's the layer we want to apply this adjustment gradient map to. Then click on Layer, go to Adjustment Layer, and select Gradient Map. The default settings are fine, so hopefully your color is white. The mode is normal, opacity 100%. There you go. So if you don't have this open, this adjustments layer, all you need to do is double click on this little graphic. And if you don't see that little graphic, that means your layers are not open. So that's underneath Window, Layers, and double click on the graphic, gives you the adjustment. Double click on this and it will allow you to change it. Now, I'm willing to bet half of you probably had a big question mark because let me get rid of that gradient map. You may or may not have had your foregrounds and background colors set. You want black on top and white on the bottom. So what I've done here is just set gray to the back and white on the top. I'm backing up here and just showing you the wrong way to do this. If I apply that gradient map once again, the adjustment layer, watch what happens. Something weird happened. And again, just avoid that by having black on top, white on the bottom. So let's undo. I can hit this little kind of foreground, background reset button right there. Adjustment layers, gradient map. Okay, back on track. Now to adjust this, I'll double click in my adjustment layer and watch what happens as I drag the black to the left. I'm telling it to start at a lower point, so I can see in my map, the black kind of starts right at the bottom right-hand corner, which is the lowest point of my USGS topographic map. And I'll do the same on the white. So this is essentially saying that on the gradient layer, past a certain point, everything is just white. So that looks pretty good. I've got the white just starting at the highest point of my map and the black just starting at the lowest. I'll hit OK. Let's zoom in. Now I can apply the crop tool as I did before. It should still snap to the layer extents over here. You might have to select it to get it to actually snap. Hit enter. And now we can get rid of the Mosaic USGS because the sole purpose was just to kind of tell us what area we're working with. And you know what, while we're here, it's probably worthwhile to flatten the image. The nice thing about gradient layers or adjustment layers is that they're non-destructive. All I need to do is turn off that adjustment layer and I'm back to my non-destructed, still cropped base layer. But I think to mosaic this back, it'll work better if this is merged. So I'll just right click on that gradient layer and select merge down. There we go. Probably wouldn't hurt to save it either. Okay, now back to here. We'll just repeat the steps that we did before, but now the file size won't balloon out of control because we've cropped it down and adjusted the gradient layer to be more reflective of the highs and lows in terms of elevation over here. So USGS map selected, hit Mosaic, click on the other open file, and do OK. If I zoom out just a little bit here, you'll notice that it resized my canvas a little bit, and that just has to do with the different coordinate systems. When I transformed, or when I mosaiced one into the other, it had to apply some transformation, which essentially gives you these little slivers of space around the edges. If I turn off that layer, I can see that it just expanded my canvas size. That's fine. We'll just crop that out in a future step. If I turn this back on. Now, if you just kind of know your way around Photoshop, you might think you could just do something like turn on multiply, and it sort of looks like it works, but it doesn't really, because there's no shading here. It's purely elevation based. So the shades of gray or black in that layer just represent an elevation. They don't represent a side of a hill. So in this area here, that's all the same depressed area, but right now it kind of looks like the shade of a hill, which it's not. Let's reset that back to 100% and put that back to normal. Oops, I've got the folder on. And when you do a mosaic, it automatically puts it in a folder in your layers. Oops, let me move that back so you can see it. That's not totally necessary. I can drag this out and then get rid of that layer. All that is really important is that it exists in its own separate layer that we can adjust.